So I just got back from seeing Reagan, and I gotta say, that had to be one of the most infuriating movies I might have ever seen. Okay, a couple things to preface this review. I don't really know anything about Ronald Reagan. I was hoping to know a little bit more about him after watching this movie, but honestly, I feel like I might actually know less somehow. There are two things that I know about Ronald Reagan. He is very popular among older conservatives, which very much seem to be the demographic of like everybody in the theater with me, and younger liberals hate him. Also, he was in the feature film Bedtime for Bonzo. These are the things I know about Ronald Reagan. So I went into this movie hoping to kind of get a better picture about what this dude's life looked like, how he impacted American politics, because he was an important person. He's the president of the United States, so I feel like there has to be some kind of a story to tell. But they didn't do it in this movie. This movie is goddamn infuriating in the way that it is structured and laid out. There's like a frame narrative, so like it starts with this like former Soviet spy telling us about like all the intel he gathered on Reagan over the years, which could have been an interesting way to kind of bridge gaps in time in this story and like more efficiently get to the important parts of Reagan's life. But instead, this Russian dude just talks over the entire movie. Like 80% of this movie is just Jon Voight for some reason using a Russian accent and just talking over the entire goddamn thing. And the movie doesn't just play in chronological order, it jumps around so much, it's legitimately hard to follow without giant subtitles telling you like when we are and who the fuck everyone is. But it's not just the structure of this movie, it's the depiction of Reagan himself that makes this movie so annoying. They almost smooth out any like nuances from him. I feel like a lot of the decisions that he had to make were probably interesting and complex enough to make an entire movie about, but the way that this movie works is that he's always right. And every single character is always like, Ronald, there's no way that's gonna work. And he's always like, it's me, Ronald Reagan. If we trust in God and the Bible and America, it will all work out just fine. And then it always does. You see, the key to being a good political leader is just always make the right choice. This movie definitely also wants you to cream your fucking jeans every time he says one of his signature lines. Like the build up to the tear down this wall speech is so cheesy, it's legitimately so funny. Like there's a bunch of people high-fiving each other after he says it, and then it cuts to the Soviet Union leaders, and they're all just like sitting around a TV watching his speech, looking utterly defeated. It just feels like a movie made for fans of Ronald Reagan, and I feel like this dude was probably interesting enough that you could have entertained me way more by actually illustrating like the difficult decisions he had to make. Because that above everything else is my problem with this movie. There are never any character-based explanations for any of the choices he makes. Someone's just like, you should endorse this Republican candidate, and then also you should run for state senator. And Reagan's just like, what if I ran for governor instead? And then he becomes the governor, and you never see anything about like why he wanted to be governor, what was personally motivating him to get into politics, outside this like really like cliche boilerplate explanation like, since he was a young man, he just always felt the desire to do good in the world. And like maybe he did. Again, I don't fucking know anything about Ronald Reagan, but I have to imagine that these decisions were much more complex. He retires from being governor and he's just like hanging out on a ranch, petting some horses. This dude fucking loved horses, apparently. I learned that yesterday. And his brother comes over and he's like, damn, communism really keeps happening. And Reagan's like, yeah, you're right. I guess I'll run for president. Can we take a minute to focus on like the emotional and intellectual journey that must have led up to that decision? That's what a movie is, guys. Dude, don't even get me started talking about Nancy because she was the most annoyingly written character in this entire thing. She's just a fucking department store mannequin who gets struck with a bad case of Reagan boner the literal first time they meet. There's so much sexual tension between them in the scene they meet. He's like, maybe we should get dinner sometime. And she's like, I guess I just think old politicians are kinda hot. This character only exists to tell Reagan like how good a man he is and how if he just listens to his instincts and believes in God, everything will work out fine. And it always does. There's no exploration of like the difficulty that must come with being such a highly public figure, you know, having your husband be the person running the country. I feel like that would be a really interesting thing to see. But instead she's just like a cardboard cutout of like a dutiful Christian wife. It's just kind of boring. Again, I don't know anything about these people, so maybe they were really this cliche and fake, but if that's the case, I don't think there was an interesting movie that you could have made about them. However, if, as I suspect, they were probably much more flawed and complex people who presided over an administration whose legacy I feel like is pretty politically polarized, then I think maybe you should have just written them that way, and then maybe your movie would have been good. While I was watching this movie, I could not stop thinking about Oppenheimer. I felt like this movie was like the anti-Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer is about a person who had to make really difficult choices and who spent his entire life feeling guilty and regretful about his role in the destruction that stemmed from those choices. The movie admires him for what he was able to accomplish, but it's not afraid to explore the worst parts of him because those parts make a character three-dimensional, and because those parts are oftentimes what motivate complex people. So you get an understanding of why all this stuff is happening, not just that it happened. Nuance is like the point of Oppenheimer, where it feels like Reagan went out of its way to be overly simplistic. Same thing with Nancy in Reagan versus Kitty in Oppenheimer. Instead of just being like the fucking wax statue cheerleader for Oppenheimer, they literally disagree with each other for like 90% of this movie, and yet at the end of their lives, she's still there standing by his side. Kind of makes you ask a lot of interesting questions about this character and like what was motivating her and like how she was justifying all this stuff. Did I expect people who made Reagan to be able to write characters with that level of nuance and complexity? Not really, but like, give me something. I honestly did think at first that Reagan was sort of trying to crib off of Oppenheimer's success because it's got this frame narrative and it's very non-linear. Like structurally, it seemed like they took some inspiration, but then I found out that this movie was actually filmed in 2020. Can't imagine why it took them 4 years to find someone to distribute this. This movie got me thinking a lot about biopics, especially the Lincoln biopic from 2012, which I feel like did exactly what this movie should have done. Granted, the subject of that movie is much more universally popular than Reagan, so they almost probably didn't feel the need to do kind of like a softball approach to the character. But still, instead of telling you Lincoln's entire life story, which I feel like would have been easy to do just to get some like sympathy points, like, oh, this dude taught himself how to read and fucking built log cabins with his bare hands. Did Lincoln do that? I actually don't know. Instead of starting from the beginning, it starts 4 months before he dies, and the entire movie is about those 4 months. Because the creators understood that you can get the measure of someone's character a lot better by giving a full picture of their most difficult moments instead of going, at age 10, he loved the Bible. At age 11, he read this one book. At age 12, so you watch this dude scrape and claw and play political games and sort of engage in a system that he thinks is sort of stupid at times to secure what is arguably the most important constitutional amendment of all time. You can tell the movie is very admiring of Lincoln, but it's not fawning over him. You watch him slap his son and get into a screaming match with his wife, but those things are part of who he is. So now you actually have some understanding of the person instead of this like whitewashed propaganda puff piece. Why is this irritating me so much? Because the subject matter of the movie legitimately seems interesting. It seems like Reagan had a lot of things going for him in the sense that he really learned how to communicate to ordinary people about complex topics, but also that his administration was kind of like racked with a couple scandals. And there was like maybe 5 minutes of this movie where it dealt with the fact that he was maybe gonna get impeached over it. There was like a lot of controversy there, but they never like dug into like what his decision was, like why he did what he did. It was just like, oh, and then some bad shit happened, and then he was still the greatest man who ever lived. And it would have been cool if the movie like intellectually respected its audience enough to like get into the nitty-gritty and like look at some of the decisions he made. And it was just disappointing to see, instead of somebody taking interesting subject material and making like a thought-provoking movie out of it, them just kind of like playing the hits for an audience that really doesn't give a shit how complex this man's decisions were, or whether or not he was right or wrong, or like what was motivating him. They just want to see a movie that makes him look like the greatest American hero of all time. Maybe one day someone will make a real movie about Reagan that actually delves into these issues, and then we can all just forget about this one. I already have.